Finally today, I want to share a portion of my interview with Caitlin Saposi-Belknap, National Director of Move to Amend. A while back, I sat down with Caitlin to discuss amending the Constitution, working inside versus outside the system, and finding hope without optimism in the fight. Take a look. Okay, so first of all, let's start with your work with Move to Amend. I know that we've mentioned it on the show before, but I want to bring folks up to speed. Where are we at right now?
Well, thanks for having me on again. Move to Amend is a national campaign to amend the Constitution to end corporate personhood and to get money out of politics. And we formed with the Citizens United decision. However, have been working on this since well before that because Citizens United is not actually where corporations first got their constitutional rights from the Supreme Court. That goes way back. So our amendment is in Congress, in the House. It's House Joint Resolution 48, or the We the People Amendment. And I think it's around 60 co-sponsors. There are several that are coming on next week. So when this airs, I'm not quite sure where it will be. And we are working on getting it introduced in the Senate too. But a lot of the work that we do is actually not so much like the lobbying of Congress. We do some of that. That's why I'm here in DC this summer. But mostly we do movement building and education work on all the ways that corporations having rights undermines democracy and basically makes it impossible to hold corporations accountable. And that affects many different arenas.
So I want to ask you, because this is oftentimes one of the things that I know that a lot of people have issues with, is the idea that you're basically at this point asking Congress to vote against its own interests because Congress is essentially owned, just like our government is owned by big corporations and corporate powers. So how does that, how do you facilitate that?
Well, I mean, this is a good question. And I think that, ultimately we may need to threaten to go around Congress through a constitutional convention or engage in civil disobedience to put the pressure on. But the reality is that I think that at the end of the day, we still have the ability to decide whether they're there or not. I mean, there's a lot of powers and money keeping the folks who are in Congress there and making it hard for us to elect different people. But at the end of the day, the consent of the governed thing, I think, is an important element that we have, and we're not currently exercising it to our full ability. And so that's part of the power that we're trying to build, of a movement that is not just about amending the Constitution, but is about trying to claim the authority to govern ourselves, which we have never actually really had in this country, because initially there was a small number of people who defined themselves as the only human beings. And then as movements were built to drive others who were left out into the Constitution, corporations were able to kind of through the back door also get defined as people. And that is sort of where we are now. And so it's kind of the, American promise that was never fully realized, and the human rights struggle that this country has always been about. And so that's kind of how we see it. And in that context, I mean, I guess the other option would be to just sort of give up and go about living our lives and not even worrying about politics. But if we are going to engage in any level politically, then we can't have corporations having constitutional rights, because anything we do to try to exercise control over them is ultimately vulnerable to large corporations going into court and saying, no, that violates our constitutional rights, and the Supreme Court agreed.
So I want to, because you mentioned engaging politically, there's a lot of sort of push and pull, particularly on the left, in terms of the argument of working with inside the system, like a constitutional amendment or something like that, or just saying, you know what, this is so corrupt, scrap the whole fucking thing. I'm not engaging electorally. I'm just going to apply myself via direct action or, protests or something like that don't work within the confines of the system. Talk a little bit about that struggle from your perspective.
Well, I mean, I think that's a legitimate struggle that we all have to kind of answer for ourselves personally. I have done both. For the most part, in terms of my job at Move to Amend, I'm sort of more kind of in the system, although Move to Amend is pretty scrappy and also pretty, not... it's not like when we show up at, a Congress member's office, they're like, oh, hey, welcome. So, so I think people need to decide, where it fits for them and where they feel most powerful. But I also think that it doesn't necessarily need to be an either or. I think that there are some people who are in elected office who are trying to do the right thing, and part of our job is to help them, and also to provide backbone for them when they need it, hold them accountable. And then with other people, it's about, shaming them and exposing them and ultimately removing them. And, I think we do need a society. I think we do need laws. I think that this is a, really large continent to try to do that with everybody. So those are all, good questions. But part of what Move to Amend is about is exposing how corrupt everything is, and that there's actually, really concrete stories as to why. It's not just some inevitable system that was, destined to be this way because, it's some machine that there's no people behind. Corporations having constitutional rights was Supreme Court justices who were railroad lawyers, acting corruptly. And that's true in, Congress right now. It's particular people. And so I think it's our job to figure out how to push on these people and or make them irrelevant, and it kind of depends on your community, it depends on your issue, and it also depends on the moment, what's most strategic. But we absolutely have to recognize that civil disobedience is a core ingredient to any movement. You cannot ultimately exert and claim power without it. There is no movement in the history of the United States and probably the world that hasn't used that tactic at the right point to ultimately be successful. So we all need to figure out how to at least support it, even if we're not the ones who are actually engaging in it ourselves.
So I also want to talk about the aspect of local versus federal, because a lot of things can be addressed on local levels, greening your community or what have you. But this is obviously talking about a constitutional amendment. But what kind of work? I mean, can local communities say, well, our city council has decided that corporations are not people and money is not speech? Like, is that something that can be done on a local level? Or is this kind of like Medicare for all? Like, if it's not done federally, fuck it.
Well, the reality is that those of us who started Move to Amend were, at the time that we founded Move to Amend, mostly doing local work. I mean, that was certainly true of me. I worked for an organization called Democracy Unlimited in Northern California that did local organizing against corporate personhood and for democracy, and we had a number of different ways that we did that. We ran a ballot initiative campaign where we said in our community, corporations don't have constitutional rights, and therefore we have a right to ban non-local corporations from contributing money to our elections. That was in 2006. We passed it by 55% of the vote. It was like the most successful ballot initiative at the time in the history of our small rural community. And it was the law for a couple of years. But then a large legal entity that represented corporate interests worked with some companies in our community that were not local and sued us. And ultimately, we actually they didn't even end up having to rule against us because our local government just didn't have the resources to defend our community. And so they had to settle and agree not to enforce the law. And so, and in a way, we knew that was going to happen. We knew that we were going up against settled law. We were trying to expose the system for what it was. And there were other communities that were doing the same thing around issues that were particular and relevant in their locale. But the reality is that when you do that in these one-off places, you either get shut down like we did, or the company in question just kind of goes next door to a place that's less well organized, that's generally, going to be people of color or poor people or, folks who are more marginalized in some way that they are not in as easy a position to fight back. And so that's not what we want either. And so that was why we formed Move to Amend, of like all of these local groups and people doing local work to come together. So you know, as part of this process, we may find that it would make sense for maybe at the state level would be better than at the local level to say, you know, in this state, corporations don't have constitutional rights and sort of exercise that crisis of jurisdiction that, you know, is working in a number of ways around legalization of marijuana and before that medical marijuana or, you know, the right to die or gay marriage. Where, you know, but you have to have multiple places doing that. You have to kind of build the momentum. And so we could do something like that. And we're not opposed to that. I think, you know, tactically that's not really where we are yet. But that is the kind of thing that, you know, that's basically civil disobedience on the part of some official jurisdiction, a city or, you know, in this case, I'm saying a state. And so that may very well be, you know, in the cards for us to kind of put the pressure on. But also it is so universal and that that's why we decided, you know, it does make sense to try to make this call at least on the national level, because ultimately that is where the solution does need to be implemented.
So with regards to the Constitutional Convention, are you, because as I understand it, that would leave it open to, well, here's an amendment that says that, you know, women can't work or something ridiculous. Are you concerned that particularly with, you know, the rise of, or the more overt rise of right-wing extremism in this country, are you worried that perhaps, oh, there might be a constitutional convention, but then there's this bullshit amendment that says something horrific or something like that?
Or like 16 of them, you know?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, so, I mean, our take on it is a bit nuanced, and sometimes, you know, in especially this climate, it's kind of hard to have people take a step back and hear it. Either they think, you know, Congress is so corrupt, why would you even be there at all? Or, you know, oh my God, a convention means that, you know, fascists will implement like everything bad. And we'll go back to like pre-Civil War days. And I think that the way we need to look at it is, look, there are two ways to amend the Constitution. One is through both houses of Congress to pass an amendment, and then 3/4 of the states need to ratify it, or 2/3 of state legislatures can call a convention, and then still 3/4 of the states need to ratify it. And so that route, that second route, is the more democratic way, populist way to amend the Constitution. We've never done it before, though. And so there's these ambiguities that you mentioned in terms of like, can we hold that to just one topic? And that's a question of power. You know, I mean, there's arguments that folks make about you know, the legality of it. But I think at the end of the day, it really is a question of, do you have the political power to enforce, you know, your agenda? Are you trying to hold it to one topic and can you enforce that? Or are you trying to open it up and can you enforce that through your power? And so that's what we need to build, is the power. And, then we can decide. But we don't move to a men's position is not to say we would never want to have a convention. There are some kind of, you know, more establishment groups that's kind of the tack they take on it, is like, no, you know, but we don't want to close the door on populism. If we have built a powerful social justice movement, and that is what populism means, then absolutely there's a lot more that needs to be changed about the Constitution. It was written by men who didn't believe that most of us were human beings, you know, and yes, there have been adjustments along the way, but they have mostly been co-opted too. And so we do need to be talking about a new constitution in this country. That is important. And Congress probably isn't going to lead the way on that. But we also need to recognize that, you know, the folks who are proponents of the convention who say there's no way that Congress can do this, let's just forget about them. The problem there is that they don't really take into account the current political climate and the fact that literally some state legislatures are run by white supremacists and people who think that women should not have any say over their bodies. You know, Stephen King coming out today saying like, hey, you know, rape and incest, like not that big a deal actually. Like, and he's a congressperson. So we cannot, even if 3/4 of state legislatures wouldn't ratify whatever, you know, horror were to come from that sector, we can't give them a platform to make their case. We can't give them an opportunity. So we need to build that movement for power that is an agenda of, you know, human rights and protecting the planet and protecting people of color and women and other, you know, immigrants, marginalized people. And we need to build power on that. And that movement is either going to be powerful enough to force Congress to act or powerful enough to break away and have a different conversation about what this country should look like in terms of its laws. And so that's kind of where we see it and what we focus on, and the question of like the mechanics of, at the end of the day, how this amendment will be implemented or any other change to the Constitution is almost like too early to tell. We actually just need to build that power and that vision and clarity. And, but certainly we would never want to say, you know, oh, we should never have a constitutional convention again, because I'm not okay with sticking with what we've got. You know, like there's no way we can tweak it enough to make it really what we all deserve.
Yeah. And I mean, that's an interesting way of spinning it, because people will talk about the horror show that would happen with a constitutional convention, but it could also be fucking awesome and necessary and radical. But that's, as you say, like that's on us to facilitate that.
Right. And and I think that one of the first steps to that is recognizing how far away from that we really are, and how most of the work that we do isn't really about building much power at all. That's not really the question that, you know, progressives say, or you could even expand that probably to like the left, really spend a lot of time thinking about, are we acting as powerfully as we possibly can? But, you know, one of the things that Move to Amend, in addition to being about the We the People Amendment, is about pushing our movements to think about, you know, well, if we were to say really win, you know, if we were to win on racism, if we were to win on, or homelessness, you know, or I mean, you could be big and small here in terms of like the levels, you know, what would that mean? And it would mean that we would have certain rights that the government would ensure and protect, and that it wouldn't be a constant struggle over and over and over again to, you know, beg for these little pieces. And so that's part of what we do need to be thinking about, no matter what kind of area we're trying to work on this giant monster, is, you know, well, but if we were to actually, you know, like ultimately put it to bed, then, you know, what would that mean the protections were that we had? You know, what would that mean that we had, you know, environmental justice? Maybe that would mean that nature itself would actually have rights, and we would have a whole legal framework for that. And so, you know, while yes, we have these immediate fires and, you know, people's lives, or, you know, incredible harms that we're up against that have to be fought, we also have to be thinking about the vision and imagining that we actually can win. Because if we never think that we can win, then of course we never are going to.
Yeah, and it also speaks to that idea, like, that so often we're back on our heels, you know, we're just reacting to the shitstorms that are very real, obviously.
Right.
But that we're not thinking proactively, like, well, how do we get ahead of the next shitstorm so as to possibly keep it from destroying people's lives or the planet or what have you?
Right. And there's no question that, you know, the other side is, you know, is banking on that strategy of like just hurling it at us. And, you know, so it's not like I'm blaming anybody for not having the extra bandwidth because, you know, oftentimes we don't either. But still, you know, they count on that. They count on that. And so knowing that that is working in their favor is another reason why it's like, well, we have to do this differently. We have to really, you know, put some time, some energy, some of our strategic thinking. I think we can do this. We also have to, I really think it's really important that we have to act like we can win. We have to believe that we can. Even, you know, even if there's lots of reasons to look at the reality and say, you know, I cannot see how you could possibly make the case that we're going to come out of this okay. I mean, like, I get that. But it doesn't serve us to kind of operate and come up with strategies from that mindset, you know. Then it's always going to be defensive. It's always going to be small. It's always going to be meek.
Well, I want to talk to you more about that because some of the things that you've done, as you mentioned, are outside of the scope specifically of Move to Amend, like Extinction Rebellion and things like that. And a lot of this, like some of the things that I say on the show is oftentimes like, I have hope with no optimism. Like, I do not think that everything's going to be okay. I hope it will, and that's what I fight for. But there's this understanding that, like, no matter what happens, I am going to do what I do today because I have hope. Talk a little bit, because with the work that you've done, both in terms of working inside the system with regards to Move to Amend, but also, like, you know, more civil disobedience type stuff, like, how does that play in your mind, this idea of hope versus optimism, or maybe some blend of the two?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's part of what I really appreciate about your show and your analysis, Eleanor, because I think that, you know, because I relate to that, this idea of like, well, you know, no matter what, we still have to do all the things we need to do, even if at the end of the day, it's just a matter of like dying on our feet instead of on our knees, right? Yeah, exactly. I mean, but to me, that's important, actually. There's honor in that, and it's not just about, you know, like me and feeling like I'm doing it for myself. It's about, you know, all the people who struggled before us who did it because they thought that there was going to be a future. And so we have to try to make there be a future. And that's part of what helps me keep going. I am definitely not a, you know, civil disobedience veteran. I have done some like jail support in the past, but the situation that ended up happening here was kind of just like as a pinch hitter. The awesome folks at Extinction Rebellion were organizing an action to shut down Congress. Mutual friend of ours, we were actually just trying to like get together, and he was like, oh, I can't until, you know, after this action. And I was like, oh, well, is there anything I can do to help? And he was like, well, we might need another person to get arrested. And I was like, okay, yeah, maybe. But I didn't know what they were going to do. And so then, you know, he was like, well, come to this meeting. So I went to the meeting, and then they were like, yes, we need one more person. Somebody had to back out, and this is tomorrow, you know, and so I was like, okay, expecting like a few more people to raise their hands, and nobody else did. So I was like, all right, I guess I'm doing this. And then they're like, do you know what we're doing? And I was like, no, what? But I do keep hearing about solvent. And they were like, we're going to super glue our hands.
You don't know the context.
Right, exactly. It makes, you know, but honestly, it all fell into place in a way that really made sense for me, in that, like, in this moment of, you know, this year, this summer being sort of the, you know, clear, there's nowhere you can look, whether it's, you know, outside when it's sweltering hot, or in the news where the Arctic is on fucking fire and there is no fucking ice anywhere because it all melted. I mean, it'll come back some, but like, that's insane, right? And so, you know, in that context, and thinking about all of the animals that are going extinct, and having, you know, 2 young nephews who talk about climate change themselves because my sister's awesome and my brother-in-law's awesome, and, you know, don't want their children to be sheltered from reality, who are basically asking us, you know, we please do something about this? Yes, my 7-year-old nephew, you know? So in that context, it's like, of course, I don't care that, okay, we're going to be super glued. Okay, our hands might get ripped off by the police. Well, fuck, you know, like, who cares? That's a small price to pay compared to what's coming, and to what a bunch of people are already paying around the world. And so, you know, I think that I would like to find more opportunities to do that. I think that the climate crisis is where that most makes sense. Although, like I said, you know, civil disobedience needs to be a tactic employed by every single movement if we want to win. But, you know, a lot of it also has to do with being able to people who are not participating in the action come across as a sympathetic character, as somebody that people can kind of relate to, instead of just a crazy person that doesn't make any sense. That's critical for civil disobedience to be effective. And so that's why I think climate change is so strategic and important, and just makes sense, because I think, you know, people are overwhelmed with the powerless feeling, and have been told, as long as they have been aware of the situation, that the solution is stupid shit like change your light bulb into, you know, and, or buy a electric car, when who has the resources to necessarily do that? And, you know, newsflash, actually, that's not even gonna, there are no consumer choices that we can make that will get us out of this situation at this point, because that's not what got us into it alone. And so, you know, I think that finding more and more ways to act, I mean, the response that people had to me, people that I know who already, you know, think I do good work and respect Move to Amend, you know, but it was just at this like different level of, you know, wow, you've found a way to actually use your body for this thing that we all would like to stop. And I think that the more of us that do that, the more contagious it will be, and the more important. And yeah, I don't know if it'll work, because we're pretty far, you know, we might be the coyote already over the cliff, like waving, you know, and about to fall. But, you know, what difference does that really make in terms of like the moment that we're in right now and what we choose to do? Like, what are we going to do? Go on a fucking vacation instead? Like, that just doesn't sit right with me at all. So
you can only live in your place and time and do what you can in your place and time. And in order to live with dignity, you have to try to make shit better. Otherwise.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And that is, on one hand, we are at this, you know, unique moment, maybe the most unique, crazy moment in the whole framework of human history. On the other hand, there are people, you know, I mean, what was it like for people under, you know, conquistador rule with their hands being cut off and having to, you know, decide whether or not to drown their babies or have them live in, or, you know, people in slavery in this country or people who are slaves right now around the, you know, I mean, it's just like, on one hand, we are at this moment where maybe what we do matters more than any other time. On the other hand, I don't think that's true at all. You know, people have chosen to struggle or to give up at every moment in the whole history of humanity. Maybe not everywhere, because actually I think there were also societies that didn't have any of this bullshit, right? We know that that's true, but there have been people who have had to make those choices all along. And thank God that they did, because they're the reasons why we're here now. And so we got to just continue that legacy as best we can.
Yeah, it's an interesting time because it's like because I one of my things that I love is the French Revolution. I'm a total Francophile when it comes to that. And the guillotine, I think that we should bring that back because it's just good family fun. But I think like
tried and true,
right? Exactly. That's as long as you keep it sharp, it works. It's great. I mean, it's low profile. It's eco-friendly. But I think like one of the things is that back then there was this feeling that like, oh, you could just, there were endless Etch-a-Sketch. Like you could just keep trying. And now it's like, well, we don't have the time. Like we don't have the time to keep redoing, right? And every other revolution that we've seen in the history of humanity, there seems to be that sort of like really long-term hope. Whereas now it's like, but we're not gonna, I mean, if the ice caps melts, we're gonna be under 65 meters of extra water. Like, what the fuck is that? I mean, so it's kind of, it like, it seems like the climate chaos issue is kind of like this overhang of all the other issues that we work on, even though we continue to work on those issues at the same time as well.
Right. Yep. That's true. That's true. I mean, but there will be some people who sort of make it through the chaos.
Sure.
And also, you know what? I think that we shouldn't underestimate going out with some justice. You know?
Absolutely.
Right? In the spirit of the guillotine, maybe.
Right.
Like, you know?
Absolutely.
Because otherwise, the only ones who are going to make it out of this are going to be the people who least deserve to.
Right. And that's, I've also told this to people, I'm like, if we fucking die in 10 years, I at least want to know that at the very end, the fucking CEO of Exxon is going to be in his house, or he's going to be being dragged out of his house, bitching and moaning about how annoying we are, as opposed to sitting, like a happy fat cat somewhere without a care in the world. It's like, if that's the only thing that I can say is that I made their fucking lives miserable, I'm down.
Yeah. I mean, I think that they're, you know, I mean, I think that becomes a sort of like, you know, existential faith, like serious question, you know, in terms of like what matters as a person. But to me, you know, I think that if there's anybody ever looking back, I want them to know we tried, you know, and just in the grand universe of whatever, justice, I think, is a really important force. And, you know, not just, you know, I think the French Revolution went a little bit, like, they got a little crazy.
Yeah, they started cutting each other's heads off.
Right, exactly. It's like, it got a little frenzied, and we should be careful about that. You know, the Soviet Revolution also, like, you know, that there's that tendency that people have to get some bloodlust. Right, exactly. But we can learn from that. That doesn't mean that justice isn't important. That doesn't mean that people shouldn't be held accountable for the fact that they have chosen to put us in this situation. Absolutely. And that is absolutely not okay on, you know, so many levels. There's probably no bigger, greater crime. So there should be some
and just remembering that there are people behind the corporations. There are people, there are not these like just, you know, inanimate entities that rule the world, like the free market hands. Like, there are people, and, you know, again, like what you were saying, it's the people the people that will then hold those people to account. And it's like, however you spin it, it's people that are responsible, and it's people that can shift the tide.
Right. And and the other thing too is, if nothing else, you know, I think we also have a responsibility, not just to the human beings who are suffering, but all of the other species, including plants as well, that, you know, can't fight on their own behalf against us because of, you know, how much power we have. And so, yeah, I mean, I do think that we have sort of a machine-like ideology that is part of what we need to turn away from. So there isn't just, you know, bad people and good people,
right?
You know, I mean, there is a level where you can get rid of one person and, you know, a Koch brother, and it'll still just carry on, right? And so it's not just about, you know, those particular people, but there's a reason why they get together at Bohemian Grove or, you know, the Epstein Island to plot against us, because it actually takes, you know, a good amount of energy on their part, a good amount of resources to keep things going like this. And so that's the other thing too, is, you know, I don't think we fully even realize how much, like, yes, they've got all this wealth, of an amount of wealth that is nobody needs, and there's no way to even fathom it, but they do need a lot of it to actually keep this all going. And if we were to remove them and stop them, I think that we would be surprised at, you know, how many things actually don't need to be, would just stop. You know, whether we have enough time, given ice, that's a thing.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
We should not have dicked around for so long.
Exactly. Agreed. But if anything was going to be that, like, you know, catalyst, that is a good thing to be that catalyst.
Right, exactly. I mean, I look at it as, you know, you could think, God damn it, why do I have to be alive right now that we got to deal with this, and potentially what's going to be ahead and how that's going to feel for all of us, and it's, I think, going to potentially get really, really bad. You know, I mean, even if just Trump is president again, I won't even say elected, because who the fuck knows, you know? Nobody seems like they actually ever get elected. They're just there.
I know, right?
But, you know, so that's like really soon where it could start to get really bad. But it on the other hand, you know, well, we are, like, every single one of us are very significant right here, and we have a lot of power to decide how we're going to use all of that, our brains, our, you know, financial resources, and our time, whatever time we have left, to be at this, you know, really pivotal moment. We have, you know, really important choices that we can make. That's powerful. You know, that's a power that we can recognize.
It's an incredible opportunity that we have. And if we not, and again, like with pretty much everything, like Daniel Kovalik was on the show talking about imperialism with regards to Venezuela, and he said it's an incredible opportunity that we have to basically decide the fate of these countries that we are engaging in war with, whether that be economic warfare or actual warfare. Like, we have an incredible opportunity to stop that as American residents, and that's huge, and that's very powerful, and we have to recognize that power. And with that recognition, we also recognize our power to address our own livelihoods, our own access to healthcare, our own access to clean air and clean water. And so it kind of has like a domino effect when we start to recognize our power in all of these different issues.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And I do think that, you know, I mean, there are people in generations before us who have struggled all along, like, you know, and I'm not talking about, you know, way back like it was before, but just, you know, our parents or our grandparents' generations. On the other hand, you know, I think that the generational resentment that young people have is also like really real and valid. But I think there are more young people and people in general who are ready to do something big, something that feels on par with the crisis in front of us. And, you know, if we were to actually try that and do that, I mean, we had a pretty sleepy country for a really long time. And, you know, I mean, the 80s and the 90s, that was both peak civilization and like peak fucked up humans.
Yeah.
So we turn away from that. You know, we also, like you said, there's like tons of fodder for lessons.
Yeah.
You know, we have access to more information than any human beings have ever had. And that can, you know, be overwhelming, and, you know, immobilizing, but it doesn't have to be. We can be smart about that. And we do got to hold on to our ability to talk to each other on the internet, because if they actually just take that away, that'll be rough. And they may well try that, you know. So that's another really important piece is just... But at the end of the day, I think our biggest thing is that we need to think about this like we can win, because it really doesn't serve us to think about it like we can't. And I don't actually know if we can at all, but I'm with you. Who the fuck cares?
Exactly.
It really doesn't make any difference. Like, what would you do differently?
Yeah.
Like, we're only in this if we can win. That is so selfish and weird to me.
Yeah, and very very individualistic and very capitalist, actually. Like, you're only going to do something if you know that you can win.
If
like,
you can be successful. Yeah. I'm
that.
only playing if I can
right?
win,
Yeah,
like,
no. Then no one wants to be your friend.
Right. Like, what kind of, that's not life.
No.
That's never been life.
Yes.
Maybe that's our, like, fantasy of what life is that we've been deluding ourselves with for the past, 50, 60, whatever years. But, and, some people longer than that. But, like, that's not how you make choices.
No.
Never has been. There's not very human, actually, to think like that. So.
And we need to be more human. And that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Reminder, the best way to stay up to date on our work is to sign up for the newsletter at the address below. In order to, and to those who have donated, thank you so much. Please keep spreading the word in order to ensure our ability to keep acting out. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some roster through. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left for nothing, motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been backing up inch by inch. We got nowhere else to go. It's been too many